Welcome. In this demonstration, we will draw a simple forest scene. So essentially, we'll have a group of trees and then a path that disappears into the woods. So in some other demonstration, we essentially drew the horizon line, and then we had different tree trunks and at different distances like this, kind of giving the perspective of distance. But what we will do in this demonstration is to essentially have a bit of close-up. So in a sense, we will have trees, but what we will do is to focus on a path that is disappearing into the wood. So let me actually lay down that path in the beginning. So this is the path, and then I will make it wider at this end. So as I've described before, any path with the distance it grows, gets smaller. So that's what we have with this path as well. And what we will now do is to essentially have some trees that essentially hide the path. So in a sense, the path disappears into the woods. So I will simply add a few tree trunks over here like this, and then I will add one more, something like this. So essentially now what I'm doing is to simply add some tree trunks behind which the path is disappearing, something like this over here, and then I will add a bit more over here. So these are different tree trunks that will kind of hide our path behind which the path will disappear. And I will also add a bit more on this side. So that's the other side of the path where we have the tree trunks as well. So one over here. And then what I'm doing also is to change the location. So one is over here, one is at the back a little bit, and then I can have another one over here. So essentially adding a bit at different locations. And as you can see, as I'm getting closer to the viewer, this side, my trees, they will increase in size. So I can have the biggest tree right over here, something like this. So this is essentially a very simple drawing, but this always looks very pleasing because you have a path that is disappearing, and once we get the shading for these tree trunks done, it starts to really take a nice character. And what you can also do is to draw smaller trees in between the distance. So once you have those two tree trunks defined, then I have a small space left, and then I can add one more small tree trunk over here as well. So that's what I will do. I will add one more small one over here, and as you can see, I'm keeping it a bit further back, and that's why I can draw it smaller. So any tree that is a bit further back, for example, at this location or this location, at this location it will even become smaller. So I'll just have a very small tree trunk over here like this. So you can just lay down some initial tree trunks, and we can have their bark texture done, and then with that we can evolve. So if you feel like adding a bit more tree trunks, then we can do that at that point. So now let's see how we can shade these tree trunks to bring out their bark texture and give it a nice feel of roundness. So now we have seen in other tutorials that one of the simplest stroke to use to texture the bark is like this. These are the angular lines that are intersecting each other like this. So these intersecting angular lines, they provide a nice way to add some kind of bark texture to the trees. And the other approach that we have seen is to use these kind of horizontal and parallel wiggly lines like this. So these horizontal and parallel wiggly lines, when they intersect, they give a feel for again a kind of bark texture in the tree trunk. So that's what we will do. So we'll use a combination of these two strokes to essentially shade the bark for these tree trunks. And the other thing that we have also seen is that if your bark trunk, if your trunk grows very small with distance, then all you can do is to simply add this kind of jagged darkness to it. And adding this kind of jagged darkness essentially also gives a kind of a roundness to the form, and gives some hint of the bark texture for the trunk. So that's what we will do. So actually we will start by doing this kind of jagged darkness for these tree for these trunks that are much smaller at the distance. So I will start by first adding this kind of jagged darkness to this tree trunk over here. And as you can see just by adding a bit of jagged darkness to one end and leaving a bit of white on the other end, this acquires kind of feel for the roundness and also a bit of bark texture in it. So I will do the same for this tree trunk over here as well, that is small because it's at the distance. And what you can also do is to add a bit of this kind of dark to the other side. So remember not to lose this white, and a small sliver of white and gives it a feel of roundness. But what you can also do is to add a bit of kind of jaggedness to the other edges as well. So I'll do that over here. So add a bit of jaggedness to this edge over here, and this is how easily you can add a bit of texture to the trunks that are much thinner because of the distance. So at least we can give them a feel of roundness. So this is how we do them so easily. So there we have it, right? And what we will do next is to essentially kind of use these two strokes to texture the other trunk. So I'll start with this trunk, and what I will do is to use these wiggly lines over here. So what I do is I lay down one layer of wiggly lines over here like this, And again, you don't use the parallel lines, but give a small wiggle like this, that imitates a kind of bark feel better. So we just use these wiggly lines. And then what I also need to do is to darken one end. So as we have seen before, in any trunk you need to have one end more darker than the other to bring out the roundness. So what we do is just simply add more of these wiggly lines over here. So again, I'm using the same stroke, but what I'm now doing is to essentially darken one end more to bring out that roundness form for our trunk. So I just keep adding the same wiggly lines over here, and the one end starts to grow darker. And as you can see, what happens is that as you start to give it a bit of darkness to one end, it starts to acquire a feel of roundness. It starts to get a feel of volume. So that's what we will do. And essentially now we have this one end darker and the other lighter. And again, I go ahead and add a bit of this kind of jagged darkness to this trunk as well to give it a bit of more rough feel for the bark. So there we have it, right? So now we have a bit of nice feel of bark texture for this trunk as well. And I'll go ahead and use the same stroke for this tree as well. So I will use this kind of wiggly lines as well, and give it one uniform layer, and then I will go ahead and add a bit more wiggly lines to the one end to again bring out its roundness. So that's that's how you do it. Simply keep adding these wiggly lines, create one uniform layer, and then add a bit more to the other end to bring out the roundness. So there we have this kind of bark texture done for this trunk as well. And for this trunk I'll use a slightly this different approach. So it's always good to kind of mix and match your different strokes so that there is you have a different variety of strokes. So what I will do is I will use this kind of slightly angular lines to define the bark for this trunk. So there we have it, again and again I will darken one end. So again I use a bit more stroke on this one end and darken that end. And again, it's not quite simply, we now have the bark texture for this trunk done as well. And I will again add a bit of jaggedness to it to bring out its, to give it a bit more realistic feel. So there we have it. So we have done the bark texture for this trunk as well. And now what you can do is, now you can see that there's a bit of excess white space that you would like to fill. So what you can do is you can add a bit of smaller trunk over here, and this trunk can even be a bit hidden behind the other trunk in front. So we can start from the edge of that other trunk like this. And then what I will do is just add a bit of jagged darkness. So this is a smaller trunk. I don't have space for these other two strokes, so I simply add a bit of jagged darkness. So there we have it, right? So I just added a bit of jagged darkness and defined that trunk as well. And for this trunk I will use the jagged darkness as well. So again, this is your choice. If you want, you can add those wiggly lines, but what I will do is simply add a bit of jagged darkness over here to simply define the trunk like this over here. And here again, I have some white space left, and over here if I want, I can again draw one line, draw another line, and essentially have a bit of jagged darkness added over here. And what happens is that when you add the jagged darkness, there's a sliver of white, that gives a feel for the trunk. So you can do that as well. So there we have it, right? So now this is looking like thick area of board, where we have multiple trunks. And I will go ahead and add the jagged darkness over here. So essentially, depending on the size of your drawing, you will have multiple small trunks that you will use this jagged darkness, and then some bigger trunks you can use this kind of angular strokes or this kind of wiggly lines. And for this trunk I will use this kind of angular lines. So what I try to do is to alternate between the angular lines and the wiggly lines for the bark texture. So here I will use this wiggly lines over here like this, and there we have it. And again, one end I'm darkening a bit to bring out the roundness, and there we have it. And I will again go ahead and add a bit of jagged darkness to this kind of edge to give it a bit of roughness to its edges. And there we have it. So this trunk is done as well. So now you can see, just by adding this simple darkness, we are bringing out the form, and now this whole space is starting to look like a wooded area with multiple tree trunks. And here again, I have a bit of space over here, and what you can do is you can again use the same technique, just draw one line and then add a bit of jagged darkness. So what happens is, just by having one line, so if you have one trunk like this and you want to add another trunk, you can actually just add a bit of jagged darkness over here. And this is the second trunk. Then what happens is that the other line of this trunk is assumed to be somewhere over here, right? So that's what we are doing over here, is just to add a bit of jagged darkness, and then I can simply add one line over here, bring out the trunk form. So this is how you can add multiple trunks and start to get a feel for that wooded area. There we have it. And I will go ahead and use that same jagged darkening to darken this trunk as well. And again, like I said, you can always add trunk as you go along. So I see a bit of white spot, and I want this to have a feel of dense wooded area. So what I will do is again add one line over here, add a bit of jagged darkness like this, and then I can extend this trunk a bit, and then simply add another line over here to kind of define this trunk. So again, if you have one trunk here, let's say this is a trunk. So what you do is you start by adding one line over here, add a jagged darkness, and then you can have the second line start from this. So in a sense, this tree is behind me, so part of the bottom of this tree is hidden behind this, and then you draw a line like this, and then you add a bit more jaggedness. So this is how you can have two trees that are kind of this one is in front, this one is in front, and this one is behind it. So that's what I'm doing to add more trees over here. And again, I have a bit of white space, so I will again draw one line over here, add a bit of jaggedness to this, extend, and then I again add one line over here like this to define another trunk. So this is how you can just define different trunks, add trunks, and kind of start to give it a nice feel of a wooded tree. For this I will use a bit of wiggly stroke. So here my trunk is a bit thicker, so I can give it some kind of indication of bark. So that, and for that I use those wiggly lines. So again, if you want to give a bit of indication of bark texture, then use this or this kind of stroke, angular lines or the wiggly lines. And this again, you need to have a bit of thickness for the bark to be able to do that. So which is why whenever we have the trees that are a bit are closer to the viewer, and their trunk is a bit bigger, we can use those strokes. So that's what I do over here. And then again, in the end, I add a bit of jaggedness and then add a bit of darkness to the other edge to give it a nice feel for the trunk. And again, here we have a bit of white space. So what I will do is again draw a line like this, add a bit of jaggedness over here like this, and then draw another line like this to essentially show that there's one more trunk, and then you can always extend these trunks in the end like this. So there we have it. And I will go ahead and add a bit of these wiggly lines to this trunk as well to define it as well. So there we have it. And finally I will go ahead and use these kind of angular lines for this trunk. So the angular lines, again, I laid on one layer, and then what I will do is I'll add more of these layers to the other end to give it a feel for roundness. So I use the same angular lines on the other end, and this gets a bit of a feel of roundness. And these white spots that are left in between, they get a feel, they give a feel for the bark texture. And then I go ahead and add a bit of jaggedness to the edges again to bring out the texture. What you can also do is you can also add crevices like this as well if you want. So I can go ahead and just add a bit of crevice like this over here as well. And that is how we have this trunk done as well. And then I will also add a bit of trunk over here. So you can see there's quite a bit of white spot. And essentially when you want to have a nice forest wooded area, you need to kind of hide these white spots and essentially kind of have tree trunks over here. So again, I draw one line, and I kind of just add a bit of jaggedness over here to it, and then I just draw another line like this, and then a bit of jaggedness over here. And this is how, so essentially you can really easily use these kind of jagged lines, jagged edges to create tree trunks very easily, especially when the trunks are not that thick. So it works really well. So there we have it, just very quickly, just by using these kind of simple strokes. So again, just to recap, for thin tree trunks, you can use this kind of jaggedness just to add kind of add this kind of rough darkness, and this acquires a feel of volume and some indication of bark texture for the smaller trunks. For the bigger trunks, use these angular lines like this, or this these kind of wiggly lines to essentially create the bark texture. And that's what we have done. And what you need to do is simply add appropriately the trunks wherever you see that there's a spot where you can have one. So for example, if there's a white over here, and what I can do, you can even have just a solid trunk as well, right? So at the very back you can just have a solid line, and again, remember to keep it tapered. So if you want to have a very back trunk, just make it tapered like this. So you can add that as well, right? So here I can add another very small thin trunk at the very back. So at the very back, the trunks, they grow smaller in size, and at some point you can just indicate them by having a tapered line. So there we have it, just by using these simple strokes to create the trunk and the bark texture, we can quickly depict a kind of forest scene where there are a lot of trunks and there's a path that is going behind it. And other thing to notice is that here my line is kind of simple. So what I will again do is add a bit of jaggedness. So this always helps, right? So on the other edge, always add a bit of jaggedness, so that kind of also gives a good indication of the roughness of the edges of the trunk. So there we have it. And what we will do now is to simply add some kind of ground cover, grass cover, to essentially cover the ground in some manner. So now, since our trunks are done, what I can now do is to highlight this kind of path. So this is the kind of path that is going, and what I will do, actually my path was going something like this. So let me highlight it like this, and something like this. So this is the kind of path that we have going in there. And what I will next do is essentially add some kind of ground cover. And the way that we can do the ground cover is to use the grass. So we'll use a smaller grass strokes like this to initially lay the ground cover, and then we can add some more wildflowers or a bit more twigs and things like that to the ground as well. So so to lay the grass as the ground cover, you use these strokes. So this is a very typical grass stroke that we have seen in other demonstration that you use, and that's what we will use. And what we will use is a small variation of this, something like this. So essentially, now we use this kind of simple, grass stroke to kind of, fill the ground with the grass cover. So I'll just start using that same simple grass stroke. And again, what I'm doing is to use a very small kind of grass stroke to give it a nice feel for the ground as grass covered. So that's what I do. I simply lay the grass, and what happens is that you also have this white spot that indicates the trunks in the back. So you just simply again add a kind of you can even use a dotted, some kind of dots as well, just to indicate that there is a kind of ground cover over there, right? So we use a combination of dots and a small grass stroke to start to give us some indication of that, of the ground cover over there. So there we have it, right? So I'm just adding a bit of grass, and even in these white areas that are the backdrop, you can also add a bit of this kind of dots to kind of provide some indication of foliage. Essentially, in a tree you will have a foliage or other trunks behind these trees, and what you can do is you need to essentially, so this is a white spot and we need to cover it with something, and you can either use a small kind of loop to indicate a foliage, or you can simply use a dot, right? Something like this, small marks like this. So small marks like these are very good at kind of filling or providing a general backdrop to in a forest scene. So I just use that kind of mark, and these marks also don't interfere with the trunks as such, right? So remember not to put them in between the trunks, but you're just doing in between the trunks, but not. So for example, if this is trunk, don't darken this spot, but the area between the two trunks. So I just use a bit of that over here, and like something like this, right? So this is a spot, and here, so for example here I can add a bit here. So simply kind of try to provide a bit of kind of some indication of a little bit of foliage in the backdrop that gives a nice setting to the overall scene. And then here I will again darken the edge of the trunk a bit to provide it a jaggedness so there. And then I'll continue add a bit of grass over here as well, and here. So this is our false line, so I'll just kind of make this and add the grass. And what you can also do is to round the trunks, as we have seen in other tutorials. You can have a bit of kind of this kind of dark spot at the base of the trunk. So to ground these trunks on this side, what we'll do is again use this same grass stroke, but have a bit of kind of darkness at the base of this trunk like this. Like so this is how you can easily ground the trunks, and that's what we will do for these other trunks as well. So I just simply add more of this kind of grass stroke, and when you add a bit of kind of darkness to the base of these trunks, they start to get grounded. And over here I will again add that small grass stroke like this, something like this, and I will ground this trunk as well using the same grass stroke over there. And essentially I'll continue adding this kind of grass stroke on this side as well. So what you want is creating like a small scenery, so you can even draw the outline that you would want to be kind of covered with grass, something like this, right? So what we'll do is kind of have this area covered with grass. That will be the kind of outline of our forest drawing. So I just draw a bit of grass over here. So as you can see, what I'm doing is simply again using this kind of stroke over here like this, right? So something like this, and then you can even add, a bit more smaller trunks on that in the distance. So they also gives a nice sense of distance. So I can add one more trunk over here as well. Again, this. And I'll continue adding this kind of grass stroke over here, and add few more here, few more there. And again, what we're doing is simply kind of providing a nice ground cover. So as you can see, now this is starting to look like a nice wooded area where, a path is going inside. And again, you have to kind of, cover all the ground with something. So for example, this is the white spot over here, and this is looking odd because, that's not covered. So again, simply put some kind of dots and a bit of grass, and there we have it. As soon as it is covered with some kind of, grass, it starts to look, in place. So now we can see that this is kind of, a ground as well. So essentially, just cover the ground with these small grass strokes. And you can also add a bit of interest by adding a bit of flower as well, wildflowers like this. And the way we add wildflowers is have a stem, a small flower, and then do a wiggle at the bottom, something like this. A stem, little flower, and a wiggle at the base, like this. So we have seen these, flowers in other tutorials as well, right? So you can just similarly add, more flowers depending on your taste. And here we have it. So again, I just quickly added some more grass, and what I will do is to ground this trunk as well, and that will be, and we will also give a bit more definition to the this path as well. So again, to ground the trunk, what I'm doing is using these, loop these strokes like this, right? So we have used this stroke in many other tutorials, and this is a simple, a very simple grassy stroke that you use to ground the trunks. And grounding a trunk always makes it look interesting, because otherwise, if you have simply a trunk that ends without any kind of, transition of this darker area, it doesn't look as nice. So for example, here the trunk is kind of, not transition. So what I will do is simply add a bit of darkness to its base, and that dark spot serves to ground the trunk, and that makes it look much nicer. And I will add a bit more grass over here as well. So here, a grounded trunk is always much nicer to look at. So there, and I will add a bit of more grass stroke to the bottom of these trunks to ground it, and I can add a bit more grass to make it a bit darker if I want. So this is how, it's essentially, the steps are the same. You start by laying down your bigger trunks, and then you texture them, and then you add a bit more smaller trunks in between, and use a combination of this kind of jagged darkness, or these kind of angular lines, or these kind of wiggly lines to essentially create the bark textures. And then simply you add more trunks till you have a nice feel for the wooded area, and then in between you add these kind of marks to indicate some kind of backdrop foliage, right, like this. And then for the ground, we are using this kind of grassy stroke to essentially provide a nice kind of ground form like this. So there we have it. And what I will do in the end is to give more definition to the path. So the path is currently white, and it doesn't really it looks attractive. So for the first thing, what I do is to simply draw the horizontal line to essentially give a definition to the path. And I don't go all the way, I just draw a little bit of it like this. Right. So I am having these kind of horizontal lines that recede in distance drawn just to give the path more definition, and also something that the eyes can follow. So essentially, adding a bit of these lines, gives a much nicer indication of the path. And what we can do finally is to add a bit of, wildflowers or grass on the path itself, right? Something like this. So essentially, I'm using the same line, then I'm drawing a flower and then grounding the flower, something like this. Something like that. And then you can even add a bit of grass here. A flower here, a grass there. So essentially, a combination of these strokes, that gives a nice, feel for the ground cover. So here, there we go. So I just added a few flowers over here, and then I can add some more grass like this. So essentially, just play around, add a bit of grass here, add a bit of grass there, some white flowers, and there. Soon we have a nice kind of, a wooded area, a forest scene where there's a path going into the woods like this. And I'll add some more grass over here. And again, thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to draw all the elements. In a sense, what we have done is just focus on the trunks, and we haven't, we have left all the foliage at the top out. So in any drawing, you can just focus on the elements of interest, and then, if they are cohesive, in a sense, if they go well together, then you will have a nice scene. And that's what I've done in many tutorials. I just focus on the trunks, and, I draw a nice landscape with distance, just focusing on the trunks, right? And in some other tutorials, I focus on the tree foliage and draw the full tree. So you have to just focus on the elements, that you're going to portray, and, have them in the right size and in the right kind of composition, and then it looks in the drawing, it looks very attractive. And that's what we did over here. We just drew some trunks and essentially created a nice forest scene just with the use of trunks. And I have indicated some foliage in the back using these strokes like this in between the trunks, but I really am not focusing on the foliage as such, but more on the trunks and the ground cover, which I'm doing using this grass stroke. And if you want, at the end you can also just add a bit of line. We have seen that you can add a bit of line like this to indicate a tall grass, right? So you can use any combination of flowers, tall grass, or short grass like this to create a nice kind of ground cover for your forest scene. So there we have it. This is how you can easily put together a simple forest scene where the path is leading into the woods in under 30 minutes and enjoy doing it anytime. Thanks. Take care. Bye bye.